The fluorescent lights of our small-town branch in Odisha always gave me a splitting headache, but absolutely nothing made my stomach turn quite like sitting directly across from Mukesh. It was a typically slow Tuesday afternoon. Mukesh was slouched deeply in his rolling chair at counter number 2, wearing his usual crisp white shirt and those brown checkered trousers he always seemed so remarkably proud of. He was scrolling mindlessly on his smartphone, representing the very definition of a workplace slacker. As a fellow co-employee working at the adjacent counter, I usually tried my best to completely block him out of my mind and focus entirely on my own financial ledgers. However, today felt entirely different, and the very air inside the bank felt incredibly heavy and unsettling. That was the exact moment when the old man first walked through our doors. He looked completely and totally detached from anything resembling modern city life. His dark skin was deeply weathered by years of labor. His salt and pepper hair was tightly curled, and he wore nothing but a coarse, tattered two-piece outfit made out of a rough, burlap-like fabric. He was entirely barefoot, with his feet completely caked in the thick, dry dust of the local countryside. He looked precisely like he had walked straight out of the deep, isolated jungles of the state, which, as I would later find out from the authorities, he actually had. The security guard working at the front entrance, who was usually incredibly strict with visitors, took one long look at the old man's bewildered, innocent face. He kindly guided him forward into the main lobby, pointing him right toward Mukesh's desk and softly instructing the old man to head straight to counter number 2, because Mukesh handled all of those specific types of customer matters. The old man approached the glass counter very hesitantly. He spoke absolutely no English, and his native Odia was incredibly thick with a remote tribal dialect, but the sheer grief written across his face was completely universal. He began to explain his situation to Mukesh, sharing that his sister had recently passed away after a very long, grueling medical illness. Her husband had already died years ago during the peak of the corona wave, leaving her completely alone. She had spent her final days living in a small hut near the countryside area, while her brother, this old tribal man, lived much deeper within the dense forest with his own immediate family. When he had initially learned of her sudden death, he had traveled all the way to her countryside hut to perform their traditional funeral rites. Unlike the vast majority of people in India, his specific tribe did not cremate their dead. Instead, their ancient customs required them to bury the bodies directly into the earth. The old man was completely illiterate and could not read a single word, but the sympathetic neighbors living near his late sister's hut had told him something incredibly important. They informed him that she kept a savings account at our nearby bank branch. He did not understand anything about interest rates, banking regulations, or digital transactions, but he understood the basic concept of physical money, and he knew that he was now the only surviving person left in their family lineage who had a right to it. He had carefully searched through her empty hut, eventually found a weathered bank passbook, and brought it straight to our branch. With trembling hands, he lifted the worn document and showed the passbook directly to Mukesh, whispering softly that he was all that was left of his family and that he desperately needed to take her money. Mukesh did not even bother to look up from his phone screen at first. When he finally chose to do so, a look of pure disgust and annoyance crossed his face. Instead of simply doing his job and helping the man, Mukesh decided to use his position to bully him. He sneered openly, waving his hand dismissively to tell the old man that the bank did not just hand out cash because someone brought in a book. He sharply ordered him to go away, stating that they required official legal proof of relation before doing anything. The old man left the building, looking incredibly confused but entirely determined. A few days later, he returned to the branch with a note written by the local village headman, which was the only form of proof an illiterate jungle dweller could possibly gather. But Mukesh would not even glance at the paper. He simply did not want to bother dealing with the tedious paperwork of a tribal death claim. Mukesh snapped at him again, his tone incredibly sharp and mocking, telling the old man that they could not do anything in this case, and that his sister's physical presence was completely necessary for the transaction. The tribal old man just stared at him, his large dark eyes completely blank with misunderstanding. He did not comprehend Mukesh's cruel, bureaucratic sarcasm at all. He took the words entirely literally. He nodded his head slowly, turned around, and walked quietly out of the bank. Right after the staff lunchtime, around 2:45 p.m., a sudden, horrific odor hit the lobby first. Before the security guard could even react to the smell, the heavy glass entrance doors swung wide open. My breath caught completely in my throat. There stood the old tribal man, his face completely drenched in a mixture of sweat and tears, his chest heaving heavily. Straddled directly across his broad shoulders was a long, heavy bundle wrapped tightly in a stained, dirty cloth. It had taken him well over an hour of agonizing, grueling physical labor to dig into the earth of the forest grave where he had originally buried her, pulling her cold corpse back out of the dirt. He had then carried her body on his back for miles under the scorching afternoon sun, just to bring her to us. The security guard screamed in terror and tried to block him at the entrance, but the old man pushed forward into the lobby with a desperate primal strength. He locked his eyes onto counter number 2 and yelled out with pure agony, crying out to Mukesh that he had finally brought his sister and that they must now give him the money. The entire bank staff froze in absolute paralyzing shock. The lobby went deathly quiet, save for the old man's heavy, ragged breathing on the floor. My hands shook so violently that I could barely function at my desk. I grabbed the landline phone and dialed the police, my voice trembling uncontrollably as I reported the situation. As we waited for the sirens to arrive, I looked across the room. The old man had collapsed entirely to his knees on the tiled floor, weeping silently, his calloused hands clutching the dirty cloth, covering his sister's corpse. Then I looked over at Mukesh. To my utter horror, Mukesh was looking down at the weeping man, and his lips were curled into a sharp, smug, malicious smile. It was the grin of a monster who found the absolute destruction of a human being's dignity amusing. When the police finally arrived and carried the corpse away, wrapping it in a proper sheet, I sat at my desk completely numb. That was the day I truly realized how cruel and unfeeling this world can be. Because as the police checked the passbook to file their official report, the final balance was revealed. All of that intense suffering, the desecration of a grave, the miles walked in the heat, and the unfathomable heartbreak was all for exactly 2,400 rupees. The memory of that afternoon stays with me. It lives in the air of my room, thick and unshakable. I was a younger girl then, a 9th grade student full of artistic energy and focus. Music was the one thing that made my life easy, and the piano was my absolute world. I always followed instructions and spent hours perfectly balancing melody and rhythm. But there was Lisa, a classmate who wore her beauty like a shield and targeted me with an intense, unyielding hatred because of my talent. The tension between us was always pulsing against the backdrop of our daily school life, a silent rivalry that I tried my best to ignore. We spent the weeks leading up to the grand interschool piano competition in a blur of motion. I watched from the sidelines as my classmates enjoyed their free time, while I transformed into a streak of pure determination, running to the music wing and jumping on every opportunity to practice with infectious focus. It was a stressful time, the kind where the pressure feels like a heavy hand pressing down on your shoulders. The competition was just 3 days away, and I knew I needed every second of preparation I could get. I was in the middle of a high-energy schedule when I decided I needed extra time after hours. I went to find my music teacher, Leon Joseph, to ask for permission to use the grand piano after the regular school day ended. From my position as his student, his guidance looked massive. He was a mentor who dominated my musical world, reaching toward high standards with every lesson. Seeing the upcoming stage from that angle made the challenge look even more powerful and exciting. A spark of intense ambition lit up in my eyes as I requested the extra hours. My teacher granted the permission without hesitation, but he took a serious promise from me to win the trophy and bring honor to the department. I gave him my word, asserting with absolute confidence that I would try my best and give the performance everything I had. As the clock neared 5 in the afternoon, the school day finally reached its end. A group of about 12 students lined up at the main gates to head toward the school buses, their joyful shouts filling the air as they departed for their houses. There was a sign posted regarding building safety near the exit, reminding everyone of closing times. but I turned my back on the doors. I walked thin and almost fragile beneath my heavy school blazer, carrying a lanky frame full of nerves straight toward the isolated music room. The group of departing students finally cleared out, and the main hallways fell completely quiet. I climbed onto the piano bench, the section of the room that traditionally felt the most isolated. For the first hour, I stood about 30 yards away from total isolation because a few other students were practicing their own instruments nearby. I remember thinking for a split second that the distant sounds formed a comforting background, but soon, the machinery of the school day began its rhythmic metallic groan of locking doors. The school began to settle into a slow pendulum of silence against the darkening sky. By the third hour of my practice, something major changed. Every time my fingers reached the apex of a difficult musical piece and plummeted back down onto the keys, my mind seemed to lift too far from reality. My surroundings flailed as if I were trying to catch the normal passage of time, but it wasn't there. I wasn't practicing with joy anymore. I was racing against the clock, completely swallowed by the mechanical roar of my own focus and the echoing chords in front of me. To the rest of the world, I was just a silhouette in an empty building. I was actually making a desperate attempt to find absolute perfection on the smooth fiberglass keys, entirely unaware that the building had emptied out completely. I saw my reflection for a fleeting second when I finally paused and looked straight ahead at the dark windows. My eyes were wide, fixed on the cloudy sky outside, as if I were already falling into a deep sense of panic. The physics of the empty school were working against my confidence. On my next movement, the momentum of fear became too much. The gap between my calm body and my racing thoughts widened until there was nothing left to hold my composure. I packed my heavy bag, realizing that the only person left on the property besides me was likely John, the school guard. Before making the long trek home in the darkening weather, I realized I had to use the washroom badly, so I hurried down the quiet corridor. The impact of the silence was sickening. When I reached the washroom and saw myself straight in the mirror, my heart shattered instantly. From the floor to the ceiling, the room felt charged, and I felt an intense sensation that someone was watching me from the darkness. I hurried into a toilet stall and locked the door to find some privacy. Just 10 seconds passed before a heavy, rhythmic knock sounded on the wooden barrier. I was confused and tried to convince myself that my mind was simply assuming things due to exhaustion. But just after that, the heavy knocking happened again, much louder this time. I was so scared that I screamed out for John, hoping the school guard would answer. There was no response, only an agonizing silence that passed before a low, mocking laugh echoed through the room. I became so completely numbed by terror that I was temporarily unable to open the toilet stall door. I was sweating profusely, my hands shaking as I finally forced the lock open. But as I opened the stall door, the unthinkable happened. Someone violently slammed the washroom main door shut from the outside. I screamed out to ask who was there, my voice swallowed by the hollow walls, and yanked the main door open to give chase. Through the dim hallway, I caught a fleeting second of a girl in a long black dress running straight inside the music room. I followed her into the room, only to find that the lights had been completely turned off, which surprised me since she had just entered. I took about 10 or 15 hesitant steps inside the room, and suddenly the door behind me locked with a heavy click. Then, an unrhythmic, chaotic sound of piano keys started playing wildly in the dark. I was frozen to the spot. I could see the silhouette of the black dress woman wandering across the room, moving directly toward the light switchboard. As she switched on the fluorescent light and turned around to face me, a full nightmare was revealed. Staring straight at me was a creepy, wrinkled, and terrifying face. Instantly, my legs gave out and I fell hard onto the ground. From that position on the floor, I watched as the figure reached up and removed the creepy mask, revealing that the black dress woman was actually Lisa. I was still entirely frozen, my mind unable to process the cruelty of the trick. She had engineered the entire scene to destroy my spirit before the big day. Since that day, I have been facing severe, involuntary Tourette's episodes triggered by that intense fright. It was a malicious prank that Lisa wanted, and she never faced any big punishment for what she did. Instead, the blame fell elsewhere. The school principal was furious about the entire incident and fiercely scolded Joseph Sir for his lack of supervision, telling him directly that he had no right to leave me unattended and should have been present in the music wing that evening. But the scolding did not change my reality. I look down at my hands now, which are stained with the memory of that failure. My breathing is shallow as I realize my musical dream is dead. Staring at the empty space where my confidence used to be, I think bitterly about how I never won the competition for my teacher.
This happened on Halloween of 2019. My friends and I were feeling the spooky vibes of the month and wanted to do something fun and exciting to satisfy our thirst. Being the dumb college students that we were, we decided on exploring somewhere allegedly haunted in the hopes of seeing some genuine paranormal activity. Since we're from Illinois, the popular destination of Bachelor's Grove Cemetery immediately came to mind, and it was settled upon. Once the sun had set and night had fallen, we were to make our move, sneaking into the cemetery after it closed to get the full experience without having to worry about any other visitors. I must admit, I always wanted to do something like this before, but I was genuinely afraid of what might be waiting for us in that cemetery so late at night. Stories always circulated around the various apparitions people had encountered before, the different sounds that chilled them to the bone, and so on. Anyway, all of this was festering inside of me well before we actually started driving over to the cemetery sometime in the evening. It was a pleasantly long drive, but I wasn't really in the mood to think about anything else except for the potential horrors that roam the cemetery for all eternity, or so they say. Couple in the fact that we were going to be trespassing in order to get through in the first place, and I was a nervous wreck. My friends were apparently doing a much better job at keeping their fears in check, though. For the sake of the story, I'll call them Logan, Paul, and Eddie. The entire car ride there, they were laughing and joking around, not worried about what we would be getting into or what we might see. Looking back at the whole situation, I should have known that their optimism was a bad sign. No way would we have been able to explore this place without them being the slightest bit nervous, but what's done is done. A little past 7, once night had finally fallen for real and darkness went on in every direction for as far as the eye could see, we arrived. Parking in the main parking lot was out of the question, because we did some looking into it and found that in previous years, local law enforcement liked to wait there and catch any would-be explorers before they could even get inside. So we had a backup plan. Since the actual cemetery was located in the center of a dense forest on all sides, essentially forming a square where all the roads would go around it, we were to park at some restaurant that was open super late and had a huge parking lot. All the way in the back, furthest away from the restaurant itself and closest to the road. This was in the exact opposite direction from the front entrance of the cemetery, so we figured this was our best chance of getting in while avoiding any cops in our way. From there, we cross the street on foot and have a bit of a walk before arriving at a somewhat hidden path leading into the forest. Taking this back path would take a bit more to get to the actual cemetery itself, since there were trees particularly thick and dense, but it was well worth it when considering the alternative. After everything was said and done, we found ourselves beginning our trek onto the path, unsure of how far we'd actually have to go before we find what we were looking for. It was a windy night, and even though it wasn't especially cold or anything, I still remember my teeth chattering and my skin going cold. Aside from the occasional sounds of leaves being crunched under our shoes as we walked, there was absolute silence. My once cheerful and energetic friends were now all of a sudden quiet and subdued. Logan in particular had this odd expression on his face, it being illuminated by my phone's flashlight as we walked. It was some sort of cross between fear and pain, like every step he took was causing him physical harm. Before I could question him about it, we found ourselves at our destination. Here we were, in the heart of Bachelor's Grove, with graves all around us and a certain chill in the air. Everyone split up to cover more ground, promising to call the others over if they were to encounter something. I didn't want us going too far away from one another, but I also didn't want to seem like a complete baby, so I kept my mouth shut and began exploring. Most of the graves I looked at had withered away from time and the elements, so I couldn't really make out anything that was on the tombstones. The few dates that I could read went back to the late 1800s, and a sinking feeling in my stomach started once I realized these people had been dead and decaying in the ground for over 100 years. Feeling extremely uncomfortable with this realization, I began to back away from the graves and started to look for my friends to see if they had found anything supernatural. Yet, when all of a sudden I heard it. Not just me either, all of us did. It was a low, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention, but with the way our senses were heightened, there was no way we would miss it. It appeared to be some sort of chanting, and it sounded like it was coming a little bit north from our direction, further in a clearing. I couldn't make out any of the words being spoken, or if it was even in English, but there was something creepy about the tone, like it was religious, and the chanting was some sort of prayer. The voice that was doing the chanting was deep and gravelly, belonging to some man that we couldn't see. The four of us shone our lights on each other to see our expressions, and at that moment, we knew what we were going to do. Despite every fiber in my being telling me not to go any further and see what the source of this chanting was, my curiosity got the better of me, and I couldn't resist. Eddie quickly whispered a warning for us to turn our flashlights completely off, while he simultaneously dimmed his own phone light, just enough to prevent us from attracting too much unwanted attention, yet still leaving it bright enough so that we would all be able to see where we were stepping. The next few moments we spent creeping towards the noise. The more and more I started to lose it. My breathing was uncontrollable, and it felt like my heart was beating 1,000,000 miles an hour. I was so afraid of what we would find, and yet I still had to know. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we had entered the clearing and were a mere few steps away from this chanting. Eddie shone his light in the direction ahead of us, and for just a brief moment, we saw a cloaked figure bent over something in the grass, still chanting in that unrecognizable language. The thing in the grass looked like some sort of circle with a mark in the center, and I swear to God I wish I could tell you I'm lying about this, but when I realized what the symbol was, I felt like throwing up. There was no mistake, it was a pentagram, made of some strange material. For the moment that Eddie had illuminated the sight in front of us, I had been able to get a glimpse of the pentagram's material being bright red, and I shouldn't have to say any more about that. Once the light from Eddie's phone hit the back of the man's head, he immediately stopped chanting and stood up, still facing the direction of the pentagram. I can only describe the next few minutes as truly unadulterated terror. Before we knew it, he screamed a blood-curdling scream that rattled us to the core and turned around, beginning to sprint towards us. Everything happened so fast, I couldn't even make out the man's facial features except for deep, sunken eyes and an expression that radiated pure hatred. He really did want to bring us harm, and not wasting any time, we all fled the direction we came from and ran faster than I think any of us had ever run in our entire lives. I couldn't even scream while running. I was too petrified to make any noise. Maybe it was a miracle, but we somehow managed to retrace our steps all the way through the path we took to enter the cemetery and forest, and eventually came out the main road, which was devoid of any traffic for the time being. Afraid of what I would see if I looked back, I made a beeline for the car along with the others and hopped into the back seat, not wasting any time to lock the door and roll up the window. We peeled out of there in no time flat and didn't stop driving 20 over the speed limit until we were at least 10 minutes away. Honestly, I have no idea how far or how long that man chased us, but I do know this for sure. We weren't supposed to be there that night, and we must have been interrupting something important of his. I'll never know what it was, and honestly, I don't hope to ever find out. We never did talk about this experience again after that night, and we never went on another trip to somewhere abandoned or haunted ever again either. I think that fright we felt is enough to satisfy us for the rest of our lives, and I'm thankful beyond words that we all managed to get out together, alive. Right after I dropped out of high school and moved out of my parents' house, I needed work real bad. I would have done pretty much anything for rent money about that time in my life. So I was lucky, or unlucky depending on how a person looks at it, that the local cemetery needed employees. At first, the old-timers who had been working there for 20 or 30 years just wondered why someone so young would ever want to be a gravedigger. It was hard work, really bad on the lower back, but I soon adjusted, and it turned out to be something more akin to a free gym membership than an actual job. I mean it, I got swole pretty fast. And if I'm honest, it only ever felt like work if the weather was bad or we had an actual funeral on site. Otherwise, it was just nice to be able to spend time outdoors. So, the way our cemetery was set up was pretty simple. The majority of the grounds were just regular grave sites, all pretty much the same size and same price. But the northwest corner of the grounds was a private site that contained much larger plots. These were reserved for much wealthier families, and the local undertaker made a lot of cash from selling extravagant grave setups to them. I'm talking whole mausoleums, statues of angels, and stuff like that. We hardly ever visited that area of the site except for cleaning and maintenance duties, and those were never left to me. I didn't take it personally, but the older guys just didn't trust me with all the cleaning chemicals and whatnot that kept the marble and brass fixtures looking fresh. Which is why it was so weird when I got a call on one of my days off, asking me if I had been up to that area recently. My boss was absolutely livid on the phone. I could hear the anger vibrating in his voice, and he pulled no punches when he demanded to know if I had been screwing around in the northwest plots. Of course, I immediately told him no, and explained that the last time I had been up there was simply to watch one of the old-timers using the marble cleaning chemical as part of my training, and that had been months back. He sighed heavily, seeming completely confused and confounded by the whole situation. So I asked him what exactly the issue was. He replied that the explanation could wait until the next time I was at work, leaving me to worry about it in the meantime. I was worried, sure, but I was pretty sure that I had not done anything wrong. Not deliberately anyway, and especially nothing that involved the northwest plots. A couple of days later, when I rolled into work, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. I knew something fairly serious had happened. All I knew was that I would not have to badger anyone to find out why. The boss man walked me out to the northwest plot, silent the whole way, and I knew better than to open my mouth until I found out exactly what was going on. There was already a worker up in the plot tending to one of the graves, and that was when my boss confronted me directly. He told me that if I had been hanging around the area, maybe during my lunch break, eating a few snacks among the opulent grave sites, now would be the time to come clean and tell him. I swore to God that I had not done that, explaining that I knew better than to eat stuff near the graves, as I had been well informed during my training that food attracts wild animals that can in turn do serious damage to some of the resting places. And that was when he broke down the situation for me. Something had tried to dig up one of the freshly dug graves out on the northwest plots. He specifically said something in particular, not someone, because each of us had enough experience to recognize when a grave had been dug up by tools or by hand, or in this case by claw. It was rough around the edges, with obvious claw marks left behind in the dirt, as opposed to the straight, clean lines carved out by a shovel. This was something of an emergency. I mean, for obvious sanitary reasons, but for sentimental reasons too. If local families discovered that wild animals were trying to dig up their deceased relatives, there would be an absolute uproar in the community. Something had to be done, and quickly. A meeting was called among all the gravediggers in attendance. As far as we could tell, the mysterious digging had been taking place overnight and was mostly undertaken by some kind of scavenger animal, like a coyote, a black bear, or maybe even an escaped large dog. The solution was obvious to everyone. Night watchmen would have to be present in the cemetery every single night until the situation was resolved. And guess who was voluntold to be the night watchman for the first full week? You guessed it, the young guy, the new guy, me. The only thing that made the proposal even vaguely attractive was the fact that anyone doing the night work would be paid double the regular rate, and I could definitely have done with the extra cash. First night of being on watch really sucked. All I had for company was a flask of strong coffee and a .22 pellet gun loaned to me by one of the other workers to take down any varmints. It was long, boring, and lonely, but once I adjusted my sleeping pattern, it got a little easier. Then on the second to last night of my watchman duty, I was on a little foot patrol walking towards the northwest plot with a flashlight in my hand, and that was when I saw it, a flurry of frantic limbs digging at the earth. I could have shouted something, maybe even fired the .22 in the air to scare the animal away, but I realized that if I killed whatever critter was causing us so much trouble, I might be out of the extra pay. But at least I would have my daytime life back. I crept up slowly, turning the flashlight off and sneaking stealthily towards the dark shape, working away at the earth. I had hunted rabbits at night with my uncle before, so I figured I would use the old flashlight technique to cause the animal to freeze for a second, so I could take the killing shot. But when I did, when I aimed that powerful flashlight in the direction of the digging thing, I almost cried out in fear. It was not an animal at all. It was a human, crouched on all fours, digging away at the earth with his or her bare hands. I could not bring myself to aim the rifle. I was too shocked at what I was looking at. So all I did was start making as much noise as possible, yelling at them to get out of there and shouting that I would call the cops if they did not comply. They complied all right, but not out of fear. The look in that person's eyes was one of pure fury, absolute anger that they had been interrupted in their obscene little act. I swear if I had not had that rifle with me, if I had not possessed the means to defend myself that were obvious to them, I honestly do not know if I would be here today to tell this story. Needless to say, the other workers did not believe me in what I saw. Some of them told me they did not doubt that I had seen something, but they disputed what that thing actually was. And I get that, I really do, but still I don't know what I saw. The police struggled to determine anything other than maybe a few boot footprints, but it really did not lead to anything else, as that individual ran far, far into the tree line beyond what I was capable of seeing. All I know is that it was definitely a person.
There was a thread on the main page asking cops if they have ever experienced anything creepy or odd at a crime scene. I posted the following story, and some people said I should submit it over here. I'm new here, so be gentle. This is the entire post, but the second story is the one that got the most attention. I've seen a lot of suicides, but one sticks out. This elderly female had her adult daughter living with her. She called us because she hadn't seen her daughter for 2 days and hadn't heard her moving around upstairs. The stairway going up was very narrow, and at the top was a direct 90-degree turn into the bedroom. The mother was too elderly to climb the stairs, so she called us. We get there and enter the bedroom and find the daughter dead. She hung herself by tying the rope from her robe around her neck and the other end to the bedpost. Then she just laid on the floor and let her weight compress the rope. Seemed odd because she could have easily just sat up or lifted herself up to keep from being strangled. Almost wouldn't thought her body would have done it on its own as a defense mechanism. Anyway, we untie her and check vitals, but she's gone. We need to check the body for signs of trauma, so we do that. As we're turning her over, the air escapes from her lungs in a long, soft sigh, and I feel the air blow over my arm. Grossed me out big time. Anyway, we couldn't get her out of the room because the stairway was too narrow. Ambulance arrives, and we strap her to a backboard and lower her out the window and down the ladder of the fire truck. I felt terrible for the mother because she was in hysterics, and her daughter being tossed out the upstairs window with the whole neighborhood watching. I never found out any details about her body afterwards, so I don't know if she took pills and then laid down and passed out, etc. But that method of suicide struck me as very odd. Next, got an alarm call to a home where someone had committed suicide the year before. The house was still owned by the family, but it sat unused. No one lived there. Another officer and I clear the house and advise dispatch that everything is kosher. No forced entry anywhere, but the back door was unlocked. We contacted the owner, and he told us he leaves it unlocked. Whatever. Anyway, we're in the house just looking around, remarking how it's a shame that the house just sits there unused. The other officer goes to take a leak, and I'm standing there in the living room when I hear footsteps upstairs. Now, we check the entire upstairs, each room, every closet, bathroom, etc. My partner yells from the bathroom, asking if those are footsteps. He comes out zipping up and we rush upstairs. Nothing. Doors to the rooms are open. We check each room again, each closet, everywhere. The upstairs is flat out empty. There wasn't even furniture left in the house. He's in one room, and I'm in another when I feel this coldness enter the room. It was just a cold that felt like it encompassed my entire body. Then it was as if someone in front of me shoved me with both hands. It was a very distinct feeling of 2 hands shoving me backwards by pushing my chest. I'm a cop. Normally someone shoves you and it's game on. But this time there was no one there, just an empty room. I must have sat there with a stupid look on my face for maybe a second or two. Then I left the room completely creeped out. I met my buddy in the hallway and he tells me I look weird. I explained to him exactly what had just happened, and he agrees that the place is incredibly creepy, suggesting that we leave immediately. It was daytime, and the house was fully lit, as there were no curtains or shades on any of the windows. Later, I told my supervisor about it, and he mentioned that he had responded to an alarm call there as well, and as soon as he went inside, he got that same creepy feeling where it feels like you're being watched. This story takes place in Santa Clarita, which is known as one of the safest towns in America. At the time these events happened, I was between 10 and 17 years old.
I am 19 now. For some context, my family lived in a 2-story house. There were 2 bedrooms downstairs and 3 bedrooms upstairs. My family consisted of my mom, dad, older brother, older sister, 5 dogs, and me, the youngest child. One thing my family always believed was that my sister and I had what they called a third eye, because we seemed able to predict many things before they happened. This story, however, is only about the strange spirits we experienced in that house. Everything started shortly after we moved in. One night while taking a shower, I saw a little girl around 6 or 7 years old standing outside. She had long black hair and wore white pajamas. When I got out, she ran toward my sister's room and disappeared. That same night I saw her again in a dream. In the dream, she introduced herself as Alice and explained that she needed help from both me and my sister. According to her, there were 2 bad men she wanted us to get rid of. I agreed to help, but first she wanted my sister to be able to see her as well. Not long afterward, strange things started happening in my sister's room. Her stuffed animals would be moved around. My sister noticed the changes and wondered how they were happening. I told her about Alice and explained that Alice wanted to communicate with her. My sister was frightened by the idea, but later that night she also encountered Alice. After that experience, she agreed to help. Alice made one final request. She wanted us to keep everything secret. According to her, if we told anyone else, they would also become aware of her and the 2 men. Not long after that, I saw one of the men for the first time. I had gone to the bathroom late at night. While walking back to my room, I looked toward the loft and saw a very tall figure standing there. He looked as if he were covered by a white sheet. The moment I saw him, I was overwhelmed with fear, anxiety, and dread. The feeling was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. The figure began moving toward me. I immediately ran to my room, shut the door, and started crying. The terror I felt was overwhelming. After that night, I questioned whether helping Alice was worth it at all. I continued seeing the figure for months. He often appeared to chase me, and every encounter filled me with fear. Eventually, the stress became too much, and I told my family. To my surprise, they believed me. Many of them had already been feeling a strange pressure in the house. Everyone seemed more stressed than usual, and none of us could explain why. Not long after that, my father saw the white figure himself. The figure was standing in a corner of the loft. When it turned and looked at my dad, it frightened him badly. My brother was different from the rest of us. He never actually saw anything in the house. However, he often felt unusual pressure and discomfort. At one point, he even recorded something strange on his phone. The video appeared to show what he believed was my guardian angel opening his bedroom door and checking on me. Sadly, that phone was later destroyed in an accident, so the recording was lost forever. My mother seemed able to communicate with the white figure, although she later remembered none of those conversations. One day, my sister saw our mother talking to empty air and heard a deep male voice nearby, which frightened her badly. As time passed, my aunt and grandmother moved into the house with us. They soon began experiencing strange events as well. My aunt frequently stayed home alone during the day. She often heard running footsteps upstairs when nobody else was there. She also heard loud thumps, banging sounds, and what sounded like 2 men having conversation. My grandmother eventually encountered Alice too. Unfortunately, she was unable to communicate with her. One of the strangest experiences happened to my aunt very early one morning. She usually woke up around 4 o'clock to get ready for work. While walking upstairs to use the bathroom, she suddenly collided with something so hard that she nearly fell down. The strange part was that nobody was there. She had not heard anyone approaching, and after the impact, there was no sound of another person moving away. At that point, even the animals in the house seemed affected. All 5 of our dogs regularly stared toward the loft, growling and barking. One day, my poodle came back from upstairs with a badly injured paw that required a cast. Even my friends had experiences in that house. To this day, they still say that spending a night in our loft was one of the scariest experiences of their lives. There were 4 of them. They visited shortly after the strange activity began. I let them sleep in the loft. The next morning, all of them described seeing the same tall, white-sheeted man throughout the night. They said he constantly harassed and frightened them. Unlike me, they claimed to have seen his face clearly. According to them, part of his face looked severely damaged, almost as if half of it had been cut away. My friends continued visiting on weekends after that, but they refused to go anywhere near the loft again. As time went on, I started having disturbing dreams. In these dreams, I repeatedly witnessed Alice's death. The white sheeted figure would take her to another man. This second man wore a dirty suit and looked extremely disorganized. He wore gloves with long blades attached to them, similar to something from a horror movie. In every vision, he attacked Alice. The same scene repeated itself over and over. Eventually, I saw this second man while awake. To reach the shower, I had to cross the loft area. One day, I saw him there. He crawled on all fours and stared directly at me. His presence felt even more evil than the white figures. Although he never chased anyone, seeing him was terrifying, especially when he crawled along walls and ceilings. After he began appearing regularly, my father started seeing him too. The encounters became so frequent that my dad eventually stopped sleeping upstairs. Instead, he moved downstairs because he was tired of seeing the figure in his room. My sister reached her limit first. The constant stress became too much for her. She decided she no longer wanted anything to do with Alice or the situation surrounding the two men. After making that decision, she never saw Alice again. For me, things were not much better. I felt exhausted and emotionally drained. Seeing the figures over and over had taken a serious toll on me. Eventually, I also decided that I was finished. I was 15 years old at the time. When I mentally said goodbye to Alice, she appeared sad and disappointed. I did not want her to leave, but I could not continue anymore. Soon after that, she disappeared. That was the last time I ever saw Alice. It was also the last time I saw either of the two men. Afterward, the activity in the house seemed to calm down. Unfortunately, my family began falling apart. My parents divorced after a major conflict involving my brother. He nearly died while attending college, and disagreements surrounding that event created wounds that never fully healed. My sister struggled with severe depression, bipolar disorder, and trauma connected to everything she had experienced. As for me, the years of fear, stress, and personal problems pushed me to a breaking point. I eventually developed paranoid schizophrenia. The constant dread I had felt in that house never completely disappeared. Even after the figures were gone, the fear remained. It felt as though all the anger, hatred, and negativity connected to that place had built up over the years and affected everyone who lived there. Eventually, we decided we had to leave. We moved away and started over somewhere else. Thankfully, life slowly improved. My brother recovered and remains in good health. My sister moved to Seattle and began pursuing her dream of becoming a music producer. My parents ultimately decided that living together peacefully worked better for them, despite everything that had happened. As for me, I focused on moving forward with my own life and career. Looking back, that house nearly tore my family apart. We still experience occasional paranormal activity, but nothing like what happened there. If I could give one piece of advice based on my experiences, it would be this: be careful when dealing with spirits. Sometimes they can pull you and everyone around you into situations far beyond your ability to understand or help, and the consequences may be much greater than you expect.
In my early 20s, I went through a wandering stage. I had just graduated from college, couldn't find a job anywhere. Rather than go a couple $100s into the hole every month, paying for rent while searching for a job, I decided to pack up with my few belongings I owned and headed out to see the country. And this is something I cannot recommend enough. Stay off the interstates, hop a train from time to time, and hitchhike with no particular destination in mind. It was this kind of aimless wandering that led me to the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. If you've never experienced them, the Barrens are an amazing place. Huge stands of oak and evergreen trees, many older than time itself, grow out of that strange, sickly soil. Sugar sand, the locals call it in the rainy season, that forms quicksand. And then the dry season, they can still swallow farm machinery whole. Of the few farms that I saw, they all looked like they had seen better times, and many looked like they had sat untouched for decades. There was something alluring about that place, A sort of ancient secret I was afforded glimpses of in the shadows when the wind stirred the trees. The sort of movement at the edge of your vision that follows you throughout the day, but disappears as soon as you turn your head. From time to time, I hiked down old dusty roads. An old pickup truck or a rusted out car would bound over a hill toward me. Most times, the driver would eye me suspiciously and speed up as they approached. Occasionally, the driver would stop to talk to me for a few minutes. "What are you doing out here?" one old toothless man clad in overalls asked me wandering around. "Seeing what there is to see," I replied. The old man spat out a putrid brown stream into the dust. "Ain't nothing to see around here." When I asked the old man what he meant by that, he made a guttural, throaty sound. I wasn't sure if he was choking on his tobacco or bothered by the question, but he didn't answer. He offered me a ride in his pickup the way that I had come back into town. But when I declined, he spat out into the dirt again and sped off, shaking his head. My eventual plan was to make it to Delaware sometime that summer and meet up with some extended family there, but I was in no hurry. In truth, I had been in heaven these last few weeks, taking my time heading south and exploring anything that caught my eye. I had explored every abandoned building and every cave I had seen. I had half my weight in power bars in my backpack. But over the last 2 months, I had honed my skills at trapping rabbits and gathering wild edibles. Sitting up late at night beside my campfire and sleeping beneath the stars. The night sky in an area so devoid of human influence is beyond comprehension. But tonight, there were clouds moving in, and the sun was disappearing faster than I had grown accustomed to. When the deep roar of thunder shook the valley, I knew that I had better find shelter. In the failing sunlight, I could see in the distance some structures at the top of the hill. I ran the half-mile distance and was disappointed to see that the ancient house and barn were in terrible shape. The roof of the barn had been completely collapsed, and the upper 2 floors of this 3-story house had collapsed into a mangle of ancient wood. Still, the house was my best option, so I made my way toward it as the heavens began to open up. As I'd seen on other properties in the area, this house had a small cemetery in the yard. I ran toward the gaping front door of the dilapidated house, carefully making my way between the headstones. When lightning flashed, I was able to make out the name on several of the headstones, which the elements hadn't completely erased. When they got inside, the floor was spongy, but felt solid enough to hold my weight. I took off my pack and set it near the door, caught my breath, and had a look around. The hinges of the front door had long since rusted away, but I was able to fit the door back into the opening enough to hopefully keep the wind and rain out. At one end of the room, there was a stone fireplace and chimney which was solidly constructed, but I had no wood for a fire. Next to the fireplace was a stairwell full of rubble and cobwebs. I didn't dare apply my weight to those steps, as many had rotted to nothing under their own pitiful weight. Opposite the front door was an opening to an old kitchen of sorts, but when I tried to approach it, my foot went clean through the floor, and I decided to stay put until the storm blew over. The remains of the upper floor did an adequate job of keeping the ground floor dry, and I was able to arrange my sleeping bag so that very little water draining from the upper floors managed to land on it. I got out my harmonica and played for a few minutes, then stopped, apprehensive. I didn't know what I was afraid of, but something had chilled me to my core. Outside, the storm had continued to build in intensity. My eyes were focused on that stairwell, seeing nothing in darkness, and flash blinded when lightning struck. I must have fallen asleep at some point because suddenly I came to with a searing pain in my neck from leaning my head against the wall for so long. Outside, the storm continued to pound down its fury upon Earth. As I sat there, rubbing my neck, and began to chuckle to myself for getting wrapped up in the superstition of the area when I heard it. At first, I heard indiscriminate movement of stairs and the ruins of the upper 2 floors. I was just about to write it off as rats when suddenly it stopped. I froze in place, daring only to move my eyes, and even then, just barely. After 30 seconds of paralytic fear, I smiled at myself again and was just about to settle into my sleeping bag when I looked toward the stairs. At the top of the doorway were a pair of glowing red orbs staring directly at me. Very slowly, they closed down to horizontal slits, then opened up again wider than before. I can't tell you how long I sat there staring at it, staring at me. It could have been a second. It could have been hours. And eventually, my lower-level self-preservation skills began to kick in, and subconsciously, I started reaching for the knife on my belt. Our eyes locked. My hand progressed inch by inch towards my only means of defending myself. Neither of us blinked for what felt like hours, and while the storm raged on, I prayed for another lightning strike so that I might even catch a glimpse of my adversary. But despite the ferocity of the rain, the darkness was absolute. When, at last, my hand reassuringly touched the hilt of my knife, it seemed as if the very fabric of existence was ripped to shreds. The creature began bellowing in the most unearthly, mind-numbing shriek I'd ever heard. Knowing I only had one chance, in one fluid motion, I released the snap that held my knife in place, and released an inside overhand throw that I had practiced during my years of my misspent adolescence. I heard a sickening, wet thunk, and the shrieking increased in volume 100-fold. As I smashed that rotten door to pieces, I heard the creature flapping against the wall and screaming. Just as I wrenched the remains of the door open, a great flash of lightning struck. And all around the house, I saw piles of bones, feathers, and fur. I ran as I had never run before, since I ran into my veins pumped acid and my limbs were stone. I couldn't see where I was going, but I could follow the dirt roads by the sounds of the sugar sand slipping roadside debris into the ditches. I didn't dare look over my shoulder. When the sun finally rose, I collapsed in the middle of the road. Heaving, oblivious to the downpour, I awoke with a startle to the sound of a car horn blaring inches from my head. I leaped to my feet and spun around to see the same old man from yesterday holding his sides with laughter. When I opened my mouth to speak, he motioned with his thumb to the back of his truck. I climbed in without a word, and he began to drive. The events of the previous night had begun to replay themselves in my head. What had just happened? No matter how many times I considered what I saw, none of it made any sense. As we drove, I realized how far I had run in the dark. It must have been nearly 10 miles. I was angry with myself for being so terrified by a dream. And that's the only thing that could have been approached from this angle. Everything fit into place, and experienced a false awakening. There's so many times in the past when experimenting with dream herbs. I had a nightmare and woke up with adrenaline pumping and abandoned all of my gear in an old house. I suddenly realized that the truck had sat motionless for quite some time, and the old man was turned around in the seat, staring at me. I looked up at him, and he grinned. With sickening horror, I realized that we were at the bottom of the hill on which that wretched house sat. I jumped out of the pickup and thanked the old man who drove off. I slowly walked up the muddy path that led to the house, composing myself. When I reached the yard, I saw the old piles of bones which had shocked me the previous nights during the storm. Of course, there were coyotes and foxes in the area, and I had hunted a couple wild turkeys. The critters probably had their dens around here, and they had been using the house as a windbreak. Inside the house, everything appeared as I had left it. My sleeping bag, my pack, and my harmonica was sitting on the floor, and I could see my knife sticking out of the wall across the room. I packed everything up and put on my backpack, then walked over to the stairs and pulled my knife out of the wall. I was about to return it to the sheath on my belt when I looked at the blade and noticed the dried-on blood and that clump of oily black hair stuck to it.
This all happened last night, and I have to tell someone. This all takes place last night at my parents' house in Wyoming. It was probably around midnight, and I woke up from a deep sleep. My mom was visiting my grandmother for the week due to the virus, and my dad had gone out earlier that night. Anyway, it was late at night, and I started hearing noises coming from the hallway. It wasn't regular noises like the house settling. It was rhythmic, like knocking on a door. But instead of a knock, it was a loud, soft creaking. I tried to ignore it, but eventually I started to hear haunting voices calling out my name, repeatedly whispering for Chris. It was getting louder. I've always been very spiritual, and my grandmother says I have the gift. I remember being scared, but I was always very brave for my age. So, I went into the hallway, and the noises did not go away like in the movies. Instead, I could hear them more clearly. There was a faint slapping, as if someone was beating someone, and this loud creaking. I started hearing cries of pain in the night, and that's when I knew that this was an evil spirit. So I grabbed the Holy Bible and started to pray to God in the hallway. The spirits didn't like this, and the noises became louder. They started cursing and shouting harder, and I could hear the beating getting harder, so I knew the ghosts were angry. I've always been smart for my age, and remembered what I had learned on a documentary about ghosts. The thing is that they don't like water. That's why you never hear about hauntings on rainy days. You hear about haunted houses, haunted castles, haunted cars, but never a haunted waterfall. Coincidence? No, ghosts hate water. Anyway, I went downstairs and filled a pink beach pail for sandcastles with water. I bravely went up the stairs, and the noises were going crazy. It was like the whole house was practically shaking. I knew it was coming from my parents' room, so I kicked open the door. The lights were off, but I could see all this movement, so I shouted the first thing that came to my mind. I yelled as loud as I could, declaring glory to God in the highest and peace to his people on earth, and threw the water at the ghosts. They were extremely angry. I then ran downstairs and could hear one of the ghosts bolting after me. I hid outside and slept in a tent for the night. The next day, when I came inside, I told my dad about it. He got very quiet and started telling me about how he was hoping I would be a little older before he had to confirm the truth about the ghosts to me. He explained that the ghosts had been haunting our family for generations. Furthermore, he stated that he knew I was special and would eventually start hearing them. He claimed that he wasn't home at all that night and didn't come home until the morning. When I inquired if he knew I wasn't inside the house, he admitted that he had noticed my absence, but he figured I was very mature for my age, so I'd be okay. He firmly told me ghosts are real and have been haunting the house, and emphasized that if that ever happens again, I should just hide under my bed and not come out no matter what. He warned me that the ghosts might hurt me if I go in there and throw water at them again. He promised he would come in and tell me when the ghosts are finally gone. Finally, he strictly instructed me not to tell my mom when she came home, because he didn't want to worry her about them. I finally feel accepted by my dad for being mature enough to be entrusted with this secret, and I hope I can protect my mom from them.
Following a difficult period marked by the loss of my father in Charleston,
and the end of a relationship, I decided to relocate to Charlotte. I sought a fresh start entirely on my own, desiring the active energy of city life. I found a pleasant apartment featuring a cozy fireplace. The entire place felt welcoming during the initial tour and throughout the moving process. However, that early comfort faded after the first few weeks, replaced by an increasingly unsettling atmosphere. I began experiencing strange sensations during routine moments, such as leaving the shower, changing clothes, or waking up in the middle of the night for a drink of water or to use the restroom. It constantly felt as though I had uninvited guests staying in my main living space. One particular night, I woke up with the distinct impression that someone was asleep on my couch. The feeling was so convincing that I made sure to put on a shirt and pants before entering the room, entirely unwilling to startle my perceived guest by appearing unclothed. As time progressed, I grew increasingly self-conscious within my own home. I meticulously managed which doors I left open, constantly plagued by the feeling that an unseen presence was watching me, and I wanted to avoid putting on a show. The situation gradually intensified. Occasionally, while showering, the distinct sounds of someone else preparing for the day would drift in from the bathroom. The presence consistently carried the energy of a female getting ready in the adjacent room. Soon after, the dreams began, recurring on an almost weekly basis. In these dreams, I engaged in discussions with this entity, firmly explaining that it needed to vacate the premises. Under normal circumstances, I am an incredibly heavy sleeper who can rest through almost anything. Consequently, it was deeply alarming when, immediately following these dreams, I would bolt wide awake. The sensation that someone was standing in the room or lingering directly in the doorway was overwhelming. The experience closely mirrored the awkwardness of having a roommate hanging around your bedroom door. After a few minutes, the intense feeling would gradually subside, suggesting the presence had departed, and I would finally return to sleep. These dreams persisted, eventually escalating into full-blown shouting matches where I loudly demanded that the entity leave my home. About 3 weeks ago, the activity escalated significantly. In the period between the initial dreams and this escalation, several more instances occurred where the feeling of companionship in the apartment drove me to purchase a bathrobe for coverage. One night, the entity and I had another conversation within a dream. Although the interaction felt positive, she refused to reveal what she wanted. I suddenly snapped awake, instantly sensing someone positioned incredibly close to my bed. After spending a minute contemplating my options, I spoke aloud to the empty room, announcing my immediate departure. In response, a distinct sigh sounded right next to my ear. Terrified, I threw on my bathrobe, fled the apartment, and spent an hour driving around the city. I eventually decided that my best course of action was to completely ignore her presence and simply proceed with my life. 2 days later, I witnessed the entity firsthand. I was occupied with household chores, specifically cleaning and handling laundry. My laundry setup is a small closet located just off the kitchen. I was standing inside the space, dressed casually in a t-shirt, boxers, and socks, sorting through the clothes. Suddenly, I felt a strong sensation that someone had just entered through the front door. A millisecond later, I glanced across the kitchen and spotted a woman standing on the opposite side. The sight caused me to scream, and she vanished instantly. She was not dressed in historical attire such as Victorian clothing. Rather, she wore a blue and white shirt reminiscent of the 80s and jeans. I felt frustrated by my own panic, as the sudden fright prevented me from catching a clear glimpse of her face. Angered by the disruption, I began addressing her directly, telling her that I required sleep and that she needed to leave me alone. A few days later, I foolishly requested a sign from the presence. I own an antique bell, and upon returning home from picking up food, I watched it roll across the floor in front of me. The object could not have moved from its location without physical force. Since then, my sightings of her have increased in frequency. I have attempted to return to a strategy of complete ignorance, but it does not help. She has not exhibited any malicious behavior, she simply exists here. I remain stumped on how to handle this and just feel weirded out. An update on March 12, 2019, followed some exploration of the area. My complex is long and winding. I had never ventured to the other side because I don't need to go that way. Well, on the other side of the complex within 1/10 of a mile were massive high-tension power lines. Huge power lines, and a substation below it. On that station is a cell tower. I know nothing about the paranormal, but could there be electromagnetic fields or something from there? Also, there's a small brook in the area. On that side of the complex is a standalone ER. From there, I can see almost directly into the ambulance bay. I found no major traumas in the area. But I spoke to maintenance about the unit, and it seems all the tenants leave after a year. We have a transient population moving here for work and school, so maybe just a lot of energy left in the place. They said no major complaints or sudden move-outs. I bought Sage on Amazon, and that is coming, so I'll let everyone know about that. And I am looking for a psychic or medium for a session, but have no idea how to vet someone. Any tips would be welcome. The apartment feels quiet today. I've been keeping music on low and some lights on, mainly the hallway light. Also, I only have one window and a huge slider, but I've kept the shades open on both to let some light in. It makes me feel good. Finally, I'd like to say thank you for everyone that's responded. I've never gone through something like this, so thank you for the helpful comments and the occasional joke to lighten the mood. This has been an unnerving ordeal so far, and being pointed in the right path is calming.